Bandwidth for Changelog is provided by Fastly. Learn more at fastly.com. We move fast and fix things here at Changelog because of Rollbar. Check them out at rollbar.com. And we're hosted on Linode servers. Head to linode.com/changelog.
This episode is sponsored by our friends at Rollbar. How important is it for you to catch errors before your users do? What if you could resolve those errors in minutes and then deploy with confidence? That's exactly what Rollbar enables for software teams. One of the most frustrating things we all deal with is errors. Most teams either A, rely on their users to report errors, or B, use log files and lists of errors to debug problems. That's such a waste of time. Instantly know what's broken and why with Rollbar. Reduce time wasted debugging and automatically capture errors alongside rich diagnostic data to help you defeat impactful errors. You can integrate Rollbar into your existing workflow. It integrates with your source code repository and deployment system to give you deep insights into exactly what changes caused each error. Give Rollbar a try today at no cost to you. No credit card is required. Our listeners get access to the Bootstrap plan with 100,000 events for free for 90 days. To get started, head to rollbar.com/changelog.
Welcome to JS Party, a weekly celebration of JavaScript and the web. Tune in live on Thursdays at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific at changelog.com/live. Join the community and Slack with us in real time during the show at changelog.com/community. Follow us on Twitter. We're at JSPartyFM. And now on to the show.
Oh yes, the sound of those beats means it's time once again for JS Party. Now, if you watch The Office, you already know that the first rule in roadside beat sales is that you put the most attractive beats on top. The ones that make you pull the car over and go, wow, I need this beat right now. Those are the money beats. Special thanks to BMC, that's Breakmaster Cylinder, for helping us put the money beats right up top. My name is Jerod Santo, and I'm happy to be here today. We have Suz with us. Suz, sit and say hi.
Hello, coming to you from sunny Hawaii.
Suz, you're in Hawaii, and I just got all jealous. Please tell us why.
I'm very excited. This is the first day of my vacation, so I'm going to have a JavaScript party with y'all, and then I'm going to go and have a party on the beach.
That sounds better than what I'm going to do next, for sure.
I'm very excited. I haven't gone on a big sort of travel vacation since 2011, so I'm so freaking excited.
Very cool. We appreciate you joining us from Hawaii and waking up extra early to kick off this party with us. But you had to be here for John Resig. So special guest today, John Resig. Y'all know who he is. He's here to talk about GraphQL, why he's excited about it, why he thinks it's the new REST. John, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So let's just get a little bit of a catch up with you and what you're up to these days. We know you've been working at Khan Academy for a while now. Is that still your day job and what you've been up to?
Yeah. So, I've been at Khan Academy now for a little over 7 years. And yeah, so still working there. These days, my role is as a front-end architect. So thinking a lot about the systems that we're building and thinking about hard problems about what sort of things do we need to have in place and to ensure that we can write stuff quickly and be scalable, but then additionally working on things like sort of our design system and stuff like that. So it's pretty wide ranging, but it's all very front end focused. So yeah, in that I really enjoy it. I think being there 7 years is probably testament to that. I really like it.
It must be so cool to see how Khan Academy has changed as well in both product and technically over the last 7 years. I think that's really a wonderful opportunity to have when you're so happy somewhere that you actually get to really be there to influence it, to evolve, but also just watch the audience change over time too.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. I mean, when I started, there was, I think, I was the third engineer. And it was very, the whole team was incredibly small, and then I forget how many users we had at that point. But at this point now we have tens of millions of users every month, and from all over the world. And so the challenges of scaling up from those kind of tiny the tiny beginnings up to where we are now, it's been very monumental. And so I've really enjoyed, at least for myself, like the technical challenge of working on these problems, but also I really appreciate the sort of impact that we're having. Being able to bring educational materials to people all over the world for free. That's something that I feel very good about.
So a little bit insight into some of that impact, at least anecdotally, with myself and my family. We're homeschoolers, and we use Khan Academy extensively, and so we're very grateful for it. It's been instrumental in teaching our children. So thank you very much for all your work there.
Well, fantastic. I'm glad to hear it. You're very welcome.
7 years, a long time in internet years, like that's eternity. It must be very satisfying to keep you there that long.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I think it's nice because, kind of as, Khan Academy has grown, like I certainly feel like I've grown a lot too. I think one of the reasons why I decided to work at Khan Academy in the first place is and I guess this may come up later, but like when I joined Khan Academy, I stepped down from jQuery. Like I left the project, and I left it in good hands. But like I was deliberately wanting to move on to be able to, work on a product. Actually getting to, ship something, get it out to users, and have that sort of flow in that process. And like so that's something I've been really just enjoying and really relishing. Being able to have excellent teams with people who, really good designers, engineers, front end and back end, QA people, like, and just being able to work on and ship like really high quality stuff is, I don't know, it's a lot of fun. So that's something that, I feel like we haven't always been able to do that. Certainly back in the beginning, it was much more loose. It was just, everyone had to do everything. But now we're larger-ish, and we're still less than 200 people, but we're certainly a lot more professional, and we're creating things that at the very least I'm very proud of.
That's the dream.
So John, we have you here today not to talk about jQuery, but talk about GraphQL. So Khan Academy was an early adopter of React, and now you have dove head deep into GraphQL, and you're so excited about it that you have a GraphQL guide, which is seems to be an in progress, but has some meat there book that you're writing with Lauren Sands Ramshaw. Tell us the backstory in the introduction, which we'll link up in the show notes, the introducing the GraphQL guide post. You give kind of the insights into how GraphQL was exposed to your team there at Khan Academy, and then some of the transition of like getting into it. Can you tell us that story?
Sure. So at Khan Academy, I guess we take a very, I think, different approach to architectural decisions than maybe most organizations. So like my role is I'm a front-end architect. I'm the front-end architect. But like I don't dictate anything about what we do or what we should be doing, what technologies we should be choosing. I sort of see my role as a facilitator. And so then, if people are interested and excited about things, my job is to help them define it and refine it and, get it to the point where we can start using it. So for GraphQL, that was a thing that had come up in a number of a number of our front-end guild meetings where we have these, bi-weekly discussions with all the front-end folk there. And we get to talk about things we're working on or interested in. And GraphQL had come up a number of times. People had gone and seen different talks on GraphQL or read blog posts and started to experiment with it in side projects. And it was at that point that we were like, hey, this is pretty interesting. I think early on we were looking at a number of different technologies like GraphQL seemed interesting, Relay, and then Apollo came later on, and just like all these different things. It's like, okay, how are these playing together? How are these interacting? And how is this compared to what we're doing right now with our REST APIs? And at least for us, like we have a lot of REST APIs, both public and private. And maintaining them was a real project, and it was really hard for us to kind of understand sort of the data requirements that we had and that were existed across all these different APIs. So we knew we were kind of interested in GraphQL, but we needed to kind of understand whether or not this was going to work for us. So what we ended up doing was a sort of a number of experiments. We hold hackathons at Khan Academy, And so during the hackathons, we did some experimentation with trying out, GraphQL on parts of our website. And this was just, it was not intended to ship. It just, obviously, it's a hackathon. You're just doing something just to see if it works. But in that process, we're like, hey, this is pretty cool. So sort of the next phase of that was, I was on the classroom team last year. And so the classroom team is all developing products for teachers and students and, in a classroom setting. And in there, we were going to be redesigning and redeveloping a number of our products. And I realized this is actually a really good opportunity to experiment with using GraphQL. Because since it's a greenfield opportunity where we don't need to be relying upon existing REST APIs necessarily, we would be writing new ones anyway. So let's use this as a chance to, define a GraphQL architecture, implement it, and start using it for these new products. So in doing so, it ended up working really, really well. As we were using this, we were just like, hey, this is amazing. It's so much easier to use. And then we started talking, we on the classroom team started talking to other teams. We're like, okay, this is actually really legitimate. And we started to get other teams to kind of start experimenting with their architectures. And then eventually after, a few months of this, we all kind of decided and that this is actually what we want to be doing. That GraphQL is it's just fundamentally so much better than what REST has provided for us. So we were willing to put in the hard work of moving over, rewriting a lot of our APIs, and all this. So this is still very much an ongoing process. We sort of have a mandate now in place where we're using GraphQL for all new things that we're writing, and we're starting to convert existing things over to use GraphQL. But it's going to be a lot of work. So we'll see. Well, I don't know when the day is going to arrive that 100% of our REST APIs are gone. We're using GraphQL for everything. I mean, frankly, we're not even to that point yet with React. We still have some pages lingering somewhere on our website that are using jQuery and stuff. So there's the process of cleaning out technical debt is a long one. But but yeah.
About how many REST APIs are you talking about here? Do you have give us an order of magnitude? Hundreds, thousands? I mean, dozens? I
think an order of magnitude, maybe 100-ish would be my guess. And stuff that is both public and private.
So it feels like the GraphQL guide is aimed to be that missing manual that you didn't have when you went through this with Khan Academy, which is awesome because now other people can learn from this journey that you've been on. And I think it's also really refreshing for you to say that, well, this is an ongoing journey. And, because a lot of people feel that they have to do everything all at once, and that can be really scary. So I think that I really appreciate that you wanted to go back and actually then create this missing manual. Is that sort of the thought process you had?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things. One is having a missing manual. I think there's a couple of things, which is that I think when we started using GraphQL versus now, there was just a lot more documentation and tools now than a year and a half ago, which is the reality of pretty much any new technology. But additionally, I was very interested in getting people excited about this technology, like I was and am. And so I wanted to not only have there be a new, a good resource for people to use, but also just that I feel like there's some work to be done to even convince people that GraphQL is interesting in the first place. I'm convinced, but yeah. So I think part of the book as well is just explaining and looking at REST APIs, looking at GraphQL, and looking at the benefits that GraphQL provides. So that's where my heart and mind is at.
It's always interesting seeing large software companies adopt these new technologies, especially when Facebook came out and announced GraphQL and released it. they had already had a successful track record with React, but then they also had Relay, and they wanted everybody to use Relay. That hasn't panned out quite as well. But with GraphQL, I think you had early signs of success when GitHub decided that GraphQL is worth them investing in. And now we see Khan Academy, especially yourself, John, writing a book about GraphQL. That's going to, I think, sway a lot of people to, if they were just saying, yeah, no big deal, to take a look at it. Is that some of your intention? And then why would you necessarily want that to be the case so that it has a brighter future?
So I think one of the things that has been most changing for me, and again, like I will say that I just have an extremely heavy front end bias in everything I do. I mean, perhaps understandably so. But to me, GraphQL is the most front end friendly, like sort of API mechanic you can have. And so at least for me, the more GraphQL that's out there, the easier it's going to be for developers, front-end developers especially, to interact and use different APIs. Like when we use GraphQL and we're developing new products, the rate at which we can iterate and prototype is so much faster than with REST APIs, because at least with how we had our REST APIs designed, you would specify your data requirements on the server side and say, okay, we need to get these fields from these models and pass them up into a JSON object and send it up to the client. And whereas with GraphQL, you're defining your schema. You're saying, okay, this is your model, and what properties exist on it. And then on the client, you're specifying, and it completely changes everything. Now, instead of having to do some server-side, like if you want a property that's missing, you have to change some server-side code with the REST API, then go to the client, and then change what the fields you're getting. Whereas now with GraphQL, you can just do it all in the client. Since everything's been specified in the schema, you can just say, hey, I need the username here. I wasn't getting it before, but now I want it. You just add it in, and like there it is. And in that way, your ability to iterate and is so dramatically improved, and you can just get stuff out very fast. And so that's great for us. We're working with designers, and we're doing a lot of testing in schools, and we can just try stuff out, get it out there, experiment, get the results back, and just keep iterating again and again. So yeah, I think that's something that's worked out very, very well for us.
This episode of JS Party is brought to you by Hired. One thing people hate doing is searching for a new job. It's so painful to search through open positions on every job board under the sun. The process to find a new job is such a mess. If only there was an easier way. Well, I'm here to tell you there is. Our friends at Hired have made it so companies send you offers with salary, benefits, and even equity up front. All you have to do is answer a few questions to showcase who you are and what type of job you're looking for. They work with more than 6,000 companies, from startups to large publicly traded companies, and 14 major tech hubs in North America and Europe. You get to see all of your interview requests. You can accept, reject, or make changes to their offer even before you talk with anyone. And here's the kicker. It's totally free. This isn't going to cost you anything. It's not like you have to go there and spend money to get this opportunity. And if you get a job through Hired, they're even going to give you a bonus. It's normally $300, but since you're a listener of JS Party, they're going to give you $600 instead. And even if you're not looking for a job, you can refer a friend, and Hired will send you a check for, get this, $1,337 when they accept the job. As you can see, Hired makes it too easy. Get started at hired.com/JS Party.
So as you've been doing these iterations, has there been anything that's popped up that you didn't expect to run into with GraphQL, like such as the way you write schemas, or even just like how those queries end up connecting on the back end? Or is there any sort of little pearls that came out of it that you could share with us today?
So will mention that at least at Khan Academy, so I think we're probably different from most shops that use or would be using GraphQL, which is that our backend is on Google App Engine, and we use Python for our backend. I suspect that probably a lot of people who are using or would end up using GraphQL are going to be probably with a Node.js backend of some sort. I don't know what platform they were running on, but so yeah, I think some of the things that we learned were sort of about the differences in server-side implementation, and I think there may be some things that we are maybe a little bit envious now of, like I've been seeing the exciting news and stuff coming out about like Apollo server, for example, and all sorts of really interesting like caching mechanisms and things like that are there. But you have to be using Apollo server and kind of have it integrated in your stack. Whereas for us, that would be challenging to do. So yeah, I think. So yeah, I don't know. I don't have a good answer to this at this point, other than to say that, if I suspect that if you're sticking in Node.js land, you're going to have a really good time. and if you're kind of skirting out the edges like we are, like with Python and Graphene and things like that, you can definitely make things work, and we are. It's just that it's going to be a little bit different. And at Khan Academy, we're also starting to experiment with Kotlin as a server-side language. And I'm not sure what their GraphQL story is like, but it can't be better than what's happening in Python. I can almost guarantee that. So anyway, I think that's something that we've been learning and actively learning. But yeah, I at least in my side projects where I've been using GraphQL, it's been very smooth sailing, and I've enjoyed that.
That's great. Is this something that you're covering a little bit more in your guide as well?
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, covering many of the different client-side implementations and many of the different server-side implementations. We do have a bias towards sort of the primary stack, I want to say, where a Node.js backend and a front end that's using React. Because I think that's something that a lot of people are probably going to be using who are using GraphQL. But we do cover a lot of the other options as well, because that's the nice thing about GraphQL is that it's relatively generic. Like nothing about GraphQL dictates that you have to be using React or using Node.js. And what's interesting is that we're using Python on our backend, and on our front end, we're actually going through old pages of our site and replacing REST API calls with GraphQL calls. And some of those pages are, they're older. They aren't using the latest, Apollo and all these wonderful frameworks. But we've kind of, created little shims where we can stick these GraphQL calls in. And so it's, you can really make it work, wherever you want it to run, no matter what technology stack you have. So yeah, I think that's something that's nice. And I think people don't necessarily always realize that.
I can speak a little bit to the backend ecosystem, because just as part of my work at Changelog and Changelog News, we obviously keep our thumb on the pulse of what's going around in as much of a polyglot way as we can. And I would say in the last 18 months or so, across many of the different ecosystems. I mean, Node was very early and often in terms of tooling and support for GraphQL backends. But I've seen a lot of advancements in the Elixir ecosystem in Ruby, as well as Python. So there's just a lot going on, and a lot of the different backend technologies are racing to get their tooling and support for building GraphQL APIs as solid and quality as they can. So you've definitely seen a groundswell of support across different ecosystems. So John, what else from the front end? So this is obviously where you focus. And so where a lot of you said GraphQL was just so much better than Rust from your guys' perspective. So I guess I know you mentioned a few pieces of it, but maybe a chance just to sing its praises and enumerate all the ways, let me count the ways that GraphQL has won you over on the front end. Like, what's the biggest wins and how many are there?
So I mentioned rapid prototyping, but I think one of the things that so shocked me about GraphQL is that when you have your queries defined on the client or in your JavaScript code, you can statically analyze the queries. So the benefit of this is that, we have linting rules set up where if there are any changes to a GraphQL schema or something like that, and it doesn't, and it's going to cause one of our queries to break, and it'll error. It'll produce an error about that. Now, the cool thing about this is that it allows us to refactor our APIs or our GraphQL in ways that were never possible with our REST APIs. Because with a REST API, or at least the ones we had, it was just like, okay, here's a JSON blob. We don't know what data is being accessed or how it's being used or where it's being used. So therefore, we don't know if it's ever safe to remove any data. And so, if we want to rework our API and be like, can we delete this data? Can we rework this schema, etc.? It's a huge, very frustrating project. Whereas with GraphQL, you can do that static analysis and just be like, we've done this where you're like, oh shoot, I want to rename this property to be more descriptive. So you rename it, you run the linter, and you get a nice little list there of every file that's breaking now. You go through, change those names, and you're done. And
God.
The refactoring process.
Suz likes that.
It takes minutes as opposed to, hours and things just breaking in weird ways that you can't quantify. So this is something that is, for me, when I saw that, I was just like, okay, that makes all this worth it. It's the sort of thing that is truly important. And now I think one of the technologies we've been using a lot at Academy additionally is flow with flow types. So the nice part is that if you have this GraphQL data come in, you can define the flow types for the GraphQL data structure, and then you can sort of trace a whole path through your application. So again, if we change the name of one of these props, I can just go change that in the flow type definition, and now I can see every single place in my application that's breaking as a result of that. So this sort of stuff that, again, it's making refactoring possible in ways that really just weren't feasible before. So this is something that really, really excites me. I think other things that have I'm trying to think of other things that have excited me about from a front end perspective about GraphQL. I think I've really enjoyed the Apollo client side implementation. We've been using it with React, and it makes it really nice to really understand things about loading states, error states, all this sort of stuff. A good side effect of this is that it encourages you to write your React components in a way that are very robust to changes. Because your data could be in a loading state or an error state. You have to account for that. And I feel like in a REST world, it's very easy to write something where you're just like, oh, we're going to get some data, and then never handle the data failing. And
right.
And in the Apollo world, I feel like you kind of have to do it. It's defined explicitly, and especially if you're using things like flow types, you can verify. You have to make your code more robust. Which is good. It's better coding practices, frankly, and so that's something that I've also really enjoyed. Is that I feel like the quality of the components that we're building that use GraphQL are just better than what we were building in RESTland, because we're able to enforce these really good practices from the start.
Speaking of sort of enforcing things from the start, I had a question just about backend data and setting up databases and things like that, you're obviously on a journey where you're taking like existing data structures on the back end and you're getting it to work with GraphQL. Is there anything that people should do differently if, let's say, they know immediately from the get-go that they're going to be using GraphQL? Do you have any advice on how back-end developers could set up their databases and their data structures in the first place on the back end in order for it to be as easy as possible to work with GraphQL? I know that it's obviously like a very generic technology, but are there any sort of nuances in there that you can share?
That's an interesting question. It's not something I've had a ton of experience with, honestly. But as I've played around with GraphQL and experimented with it, I guess it's really felt like it is able to handle lots of different cases and lots of different database styles or querying mechanics. I think generally it does work better, or it's a little bit better suited to just sort of document centric databases. When I've gone through and implemented GraphQL on top of MongoDB or something like that, it's really, really simple. It couldn't possibly be much simpler. And it's a little more work for something like, if you're doing it on like a SQL database or something. But again, it's not insurmountable at all. So yeah, I think unfortunately, I don't feel like I have very good advice here to give specifically. And I wouldn't be surprised. This is something I haven't done much research into at this point, but it wouldn't surprise me if there are like people building just like, databases designed for GraphQL at this point, or, kind of all in one type of deals that are designed for, performance and caching and all these sort of things from the get-go. So you don't have to roll them on your own. But that's something unfortunately I haven't done a lot of research into at this point.
Yeah, I think there's a certain, I think you're very lucky if you are actually entering now and you're starting something from scratch, which generally isn't always the very common case, right? Like, unless you're a startup that just exploded onto the scene right now, you're going to be dealing with like transitions and things like that, which is very similar to what you're going through at Khan Academy. But it's good to know that there are some sort of cases or situations where it is a lot easier to get started immediately. That's cool to know.
So from the front end perspective, and I've had a few of these conversations, we can link up a few old changelog episodes, not even that old. We had a Prisma and GraphQL episode just this spring even about GraphQL, and talked to about it with a lot of people. And it seems like from the front end, it is demonstrably and maybe even say objectively better in terms of, like you said, prototyping, speed of development. I didn't realize this point about refactoring, which is really cool. But it seems like on the back end, building the back end, dealing with caching, dealing with perhaps inappropriate or like poorly crafted queries, it's like that's kind of where the there be dragons are. And I know you've been very much on the front end of the Khan Academy team, but has that been a real issue? Like, it is put differently, like, is the back end team or the people who are doing both as excited as you are? Or is it like the front end's driving this and the back end's just like along for the ride?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I think a couple of things that I want to caveat the work that we've been doing with is that so far we have not exposed our GraphQL stuff publicly.
Okay.
So like we have not replaced our public REST APIs with GraphQL yet. That's going to be a process in and of itself. But we are not letting people write, arbitrary GraphQL against our servers. I would be. I think that's something. If I remember correctly, GitHub allows people to do that, and I'm very curious to hear about how they do that in a way that they feel is safe. But we at least so far that has not been a priority for us. Now, additionally, one thing that we do is we have lots of monitoring and logging for all of our GraphQL queries. So we track the performance of every query. We track this performance over time, and then we have alerts for when queries are being especially slow. So then that way we can look at them and be like, hey, this query is taking like 5 seconds. That seems excessive. What can we do to, make this faster? And then so we can, with this data, we can delegate this to the teams to work on and improve. But at least so far, what's interesting is that, initially the front end team, we were championing this. We're like, we really want this to make our lives easier. And but I think an interesting part about the GraphQL switch here is that the backend team now is very excited about this change too. And one of the reasons for this is that it dramatically simplifies the backend, because previously we would have we have a REST endpoint, and we're getting some information about a teacher and their students or something like that. Within that single REST endpoint is many different queries, data being transformed and mutated and like all this sort of stuff. And then it gets mushed back into a JSON blob and put out. This code ends up being pretty complicated. Like, it's hard to look at and reason about. And especially when you have a number of endpoints that are doing very similar things, but just getting data or displaying the data in slightly different ways.
Right.
But whereas in GraphQL land, since you define a schema, just a generic schema, this is the sort of thing that pretty much anyone can do. Front end engineer, back end engineer, it's relatively easy to write these schemas. And then once you have that, you don't really have to worry about the logic of mutating this data into a good form. GraphQL just takes care of that for you. So in a lot of ways, it's made a lot of our data structures much, much easier to understand. And the backend team has been excited about that because it's reducing the surface area of the application. It says now they can just look at one place and be like, well, the only place where this data model is being used is in this one GraphQL schema, and that's it. And we can just look at that one place and understand how it's being used entirely. As opposed to trying to hunt around the application to all the different REST APIs that could be using this thing. It's very, very complicated. So I think this is something that they're seeing as a way to reduce the amount of code that we have, the amount of surface area, and just simplify things overall.
That's interesting. I find myself often, so I often do small teams or sometimes team of one style projects. So very often I'm the consumer of my own REST APIs, and so I only have to nag myself for slightly different data or new endpoint, right? But I still have that mental back and forth of like, oh, I guess I need the data this way. I'm going to go add an endpoint or adjust an endpoint to massage it to be better. And I have worked in a situation where I was contracting to build a backend API for a startup that had multiple devices, right? So they had an iOS app as well as a web app were the first two. They weren't quite successful enough to make it to their eventual Android app situation. But in that circumstance, it was me, a contractor, working on the API, and then a completely different company building the iOS app. And so a lot of if you look at the bottleneck of development speed there, it is the integration point between those two actors. And the slowdown when they are waiting on me or vice versa was troublesome. And I could see where if it was a GraphQL API with a well-defined schema, that a lot of the stuff that they were waiting on me for, right, waiting on backend for, they wouldn't have to wait. Like they would just change the way the query worked. And as long as the schema supported that, then they would have been off to the races. And so have you felt less communication lag or maybe tension between, I don't know how big your teams are, if you have walls and whatnot between them? I know some companies have very strong walls between teams. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so one thing I'll mention briefly is that we do have a front end team and back end team, and we do have people who are full stack. But the thing is, like, additionally, we're pretty porous. Front end people are making back end changes. Back end people are making front end changes.
That's the way it should be, right? I think.
And so, like, it's we aren't one of those super strict organizations. I think some people just may have preferences of just doing front end, back end, and as a result, they do less. But I think certainly I think one of the things that's been interesting is that even in cases where a front end engineer has had to go in and add in an additional field to the schema, I would say that it's just easier to do in general, even compared with how we had things previously. So even in the worst case, where a front end engineer has to make back end changes, frankly, any of our engineers is capable of that, from our most junior to senior. And I think that's something that it feels empowering. You don't have to wait and rely upon, getting a more senior engineer or a back-end engineer in to go work on this. But I think the thing is that the far more common case is just like, oh, we're just missing this field, but it already exists in the schema, so we just add it in and now we're done. That's the sort of thing that is, the velocity impact is tremendous. And of course, that's helping the individual engineers so they don't have to go to the back end or wait on someone else to finish it, whatever the case might be. So yeah, it's been pretty great.
Hey everyone, I'm Tim Smith, senior producer here at Changelog. You know how important it is to stay in the know, and our weekly newsletter helps you and thousands of other developers do exactly that. It's the developer news that matters, nothing more and nothing less. Visit changelog.com and subscribe today.
So, John, we have some really cool community questions from our JS Party /Changelog community for you. So we're going to read some of them out to you on this segment.
Okay.
So the first question is from Dan McLean. He says, without subscriptions, what's the benefit of GraphQL over REST? With HTTP2, you get muxing of connections, so the limit of open connections is higher, somewhat negating the benefit of grouping queries. And the pain point comes when one of those queries is slow in that group, causing your whole payload to be delayed until your slowest query returns, which is arguably worse than firing off 10 REST requests. So I think the first part was the question, which is like, what is the benefit of it over REST if you don't have the HTTP bottlenecks, it seems. So this is less probably about the user experience, I guess, on the surface layer.
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple of things. One is that GraphQL queries don't necessarily have to wait until everything is done before returning. Like I know that like Apollo and like with like Apollo server, you can do like you can start to return data in batches. So you can get some of the initial layers of requests and return those and keep returning more as you get deeper and deeper. So like it isn't necessarily the case that it's an all or nothing proposition with GraphQL. Certainly the simple implementation would be all or nothing. But looking at a lot of the different tech stacks that exist now, like Apollo server, like they're much more robust and can handle incremental data. So, and I think I guess that's sort of the question about performance. So I think one of the things that is certainly a little bit tricky. It's one thing that's trickier with GraphQL than with traditional REST APIs is that I guess typically with traditional REST APIs, especially ones that aren't authenticated, it's a lot easier to do client-side caching, or not client-side, but like browser-based caching or caching at an edge cache or something like that. Whereas with GraphQL, since typically you have a single endpoint, it's hard to do caching at that level. So usually what you end up having to do is either having a different sort of client-side cache, like in browser, and like we use Apollo, and in that case, it caches the data that we've requested. And if it looks like we're going to try re-requesting data that we already have, it just pulls from that cache data, so we don't have to, send off another request. And then additionally, you can do caching on the server side, but it's lower level at like the software level. So you can see that you have certain queries coming in. And if you know that certain data is always going to come back, you can just return that cached response. So I think there are definitely ways of doing, improving the performance, improving the caching of GraphQL. I think one of the things though is that it's just going to work in a different way than what typically happens with a normal REST API.
So I guess as a side question or follow up for that, I guess it's more of a side question. Dan says without subscriptions, but he's now assuming that we all know what subscriptions are in the context of GraphQL. Can you explain what subscriptions are?
Sitting and try to explain. Well, I mean, essentially you can subscribe to a data source and get periodic updates. Being able to, as more and more data comes in, it gets updated with that additional data. The subscriptions are a little bit different from what I was describing before with the Apollo server, which is like a single query, but then the data that you're returning is complex. It's coming from multiple different queries, subqueries, and stuff like that. And in that case, that is coming back, could potentially come back incrementally as the data is ready. Whereas a subscription is more like you would use a subscription to like implement like a chat room or something like that, or like add where there's lots of updates coming in, or like a stock ticker feed, or I don't know, something where you have like
So it's more like a real time connection that gets pushed data from the GraphQL server.
Yeah. So that's more what the subscription is, rather than the other thing I was describing. Yeah.
Gotcha. Very good. Okay. Next question from the community. This one comes from Dylan Sheeman, who listeners may remember from the Dojo episode back on JS Party number 25. Dylan says, so jQuery, that's like a query language for GraphQL, right?
It's funny because Dylan and I go way back, because we were he was working on Dojo, I was working on jQuery, like all of us, I guess at this point, old timer JavaScript framework folk,
So in our chat room, he mentioned that you guys have been trolling each other for years, so he thought that would be appropriate.
But I think it's funny. It's like one of those things where like we, at the time, it was like the competition felt intense, or at least it did to me, where it's just like, oh man, we're trying to like change things and get recognition and like all this sort of stuff, and like, but then like as things have changed and as the world has changed and everything, we just get to look back at those times and be like, oh yeah, that was a thing and that was happening. And but yeah, no,
he did follow. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, one thing I will mention though is that he's jokingly saying this jQuery thing for creating GraphQL databases, but like back when I named jQuery, my first name was JSelect, and just for like JavaScript select,
right.
But I couldn't, the domain was taken. So I didn't choose that. And I saw that jQuery was available, but there was an open source project called jQuery. And it was like a Java library for like doing SQL queries or something like that. And it looked like it hadn't been updated in a while. So I was like, okay, it's probably fine. I can just use this name. The domain's available. I'll get the domain and I can use it. And then I remember at some point oh, sorry, say again?
No, keep going, sorry.
As I say, at some point in the future, the domain, the person running the open source project got in touch with me and was like, hey, you're kind of using my name. I'm like, oh, sorry. Like, I thought the project was dead. I didn't realize that it was like still going on. But the thing is that like, yeah, obviously I feel pretty certain that like, web-based jQuery is far more popular than the jQuery Java SQL querying thing.
Right.
But yeah, I did feel a little bit bad about that.
This is such a classic naming problem. You know what I mean? Like, is the domain available? Is there already a project called this? These days it's like, is the name taken on NPM,
Right. The age-old programming problem is naming things and cache invalidation. And up by one errors. Okay, so Dylan does actually have a serious question following up on his troll, which actually plays into some of the stuff you're talking about there, John, about jQuery. So he says he's curious to find out what you think of jQuery's place in JS history now, do you have regrets with the project? Would you go back and focus more on architecture type problems with jQuery before things got out of hand for people trying to build large apps? Or do you see it as a good bridge for people from the days of old to the VDOM based dev?
I do see it as a relatively good bridge. I mean, it's certainly of its time where, jQuery was so DOM centric. Like you are, querying DOM elements, manipulating those elements directly. It certainly, whenever I do stuff like that these days, it feels very antiquated. And I think I don't know. I don't personally. I don't have regrets about not doing architectural things, and it's not because I feel like I missed out. Is that at the time I made very deliberate decisions not to work on that, and like we knew that jQuery was not. It was not. It was opinionated in some ways, and that this is ways of querying DOM elements and things, but like it was not opinionated about how you built your application. You could build it in any way you wanted. You could use jQuery in that context, but we weren't dictating how that should work. So I think I'm okay with this. Like like if you look at like React, and I think it was mentioned earlier that we were early adopters of React at Khan Academy, but we were, I believe, the first organization outside of Facebook to adopt React. And React is just so dramatically different from the jQuery way of doing things. I don't think we could have ever have iterated on jQuery to the point at which we arrived at React. It's just a fundamentally different branch of the evolutionary tree. And frankly, I feel like React is a lot better for the kind of things that it's trying to do. These days, like I'm as a front end dev, I feel like I'm much, much happier trying to build the complex things that I'm trying to build than I was a long time ago. And it isn't necessarily because of jQuery, it's just because that we as an industry have dramatically changed how we're doing things and what we're willing to consider to be acceptable. And I think it's essentially where the industry is growing up, and a part of that is having a lot of these frameworks that take care of things for you. So yeah, I don't know. I don't have regrets about it. I think jQuery was great. It did a very good thing for a lot of people, and yeah, I certainly enjoyed using it. and really, that's when I first created it. That's all I wanted. I just wanted a framework that would solve my problems. So yeah, but no, I'm okay. I sleep fine at night.
As you should.
Our next question comes from Luis Montez. It relates a little bit to Dan's question earlier. So it's about like REST versus HTTP and the advantages outside of that. So they ask, since we've had things like JSON RPC over WebSockets for years, how much of the GraphQL as the new REST, quote unquote, comes from REST being typically tied to HTTP, while GraphQL is transport agnostic? I think that's a great point. They're asking, is the query language itself the killer feature?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the query language is really good because a lot of the features that I describe, are benefiting directly from that. Being able to specify the query on the client side, being able to, do static analysis, all these sort of things. So that's certainly a benefit. I think additionally, having a schema defined on the back end, so like you have the schema on the back end, the queries on the front end, and like those two together really make GraphQL what it is. So yeah, I don't think the transport layer, frankly, as I'm developing and using GraphQL, I don't think about how it's getting to the client necessarily. like that's not my primary concern. My primary concern is more about, okay, what data am I requesting? Is the data that I need? And I feel pretty good about that. Yeah. So I think, so I guess to answer your question, yeah, I would agree that probably the query language itself combined with, the schema definitions is really what makes GraphQL special.
That makes a lot of sense.
Next question comes from Chris, aka Canada Uni, in our JS Party chat room. That Chris was just talking about an AeroPress project to learn Apollo stack with GraphQL. We were talking about coffee during the break, so Chris is very much into that conversation. Chris has a thought, a question, and a concern, so I'll kind of give them to you in that order. The thought is it was really easy to set up a node server with the new Apollo server, so good to hear that. The question is, when should someone not use GraphQL?
So, I mean, personally, this is my opinion. I'm not convinced yet about using GraphQL for a project where you are the only developer working on it. Like if you're just building a thing for yourself and you're doing the front end and the back end and everything, like you can probably get some benefit from GraphQL, but I think that there's going to be diminishing returns. I think you're going to get the most benefit from GraphQL when you're on a team of engineers and you're like trying to all share and use the same API. Additionally, I'm also not sold about using GraphQL for a public-facing API. I know there are people who do it, and more power to them. It just seems like an unnecessarily complicated thing to implement, especially since you're letting people run semi-arbitrary queries against your data. That's the sort of thing that you need to be very, very vigilant about. So yeah, I think those are two things that, at least to me, I still have questions about. But at least the more common case of having a team of engineers, working against a single GraphQL endpoint, it's amazing. It couldn't be better. And in that way, REST is really, it looks a bit inferior.
Finally, Chris shares a concern, which maybe you can just react to or not. They say sometimes it feels like there is too much magic, making it challenging to troubleshoot sometimes. Maybe that's just with Apollo, but that has been my experience.
Interesting. I'm trying to think of like issues that we've hit as we've like used Apollo and stuff, and we have hit some. I think the issues that we've hit have been more like when we're like upgrading, like moving from one version to another, and things start breaking in ways that we don't understand. This has only happened maybe once or twice so far, and it just requires a little bit of debugging and trying to figure out like how different state is moving around in different ways. I think usually issues like that are happening, if they happen at all, are happening in like the very complicated parts of our application. So maybe that also kind of speaks to us that we should just be, our application should be simpler, but and then therefore be easier to reason about. But yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah.
So our last question is from Rasmus Hansen. And they ask, what are some common mistakes people make when working with or implementing GraphQL?
I feel like I don't have enough data looking at like what people at large, what mistakes they made. I think I feel like there are mistakes that we made.
Yeah, we would love to hear that. Yeah, personal anecdotes would be amazing.
Absolutely.
I think one of I mentioned earlier about how we have like tracking set up now for the GraphQL queries to know how long they're taking. And that isn't something that we had initially, nor was it something that came out of the box. And I think that's helped us a lot because we were having a hard time figuring out which queries were taking a long time and why, or even understanding which queries might get slower given the different parameters that get passed into them. So that's the sort of thing that is, I'm not sure it's a mistake that we made, other than that, like, as we were using GraphQL, we were kind of realizing that, like, we just didn't have the information that we needed to write good queries. And so we kind of had to build an additional layer on top to, like, do this analysis. I'm trying to think of other mistakes that we made. I think, well, I should say one mistake that I feel like we didn't make, and but like we could have, is that we didn't adopt GraphQL too early. Like, I think now is probably the best time to be adopting GraphQL. We adopted it a year and a half ago. It was certainly rougher. I think if we had tried to adopt GraphQL when it first, like, started coming out and being all buzzwordy and all that, we would have had a real hard go of it. And so I think from a mistake perspective, like, my takeaway from this is that, like, if I'm starting a new project today, I'm just going to go straight to the latest and greatest things. I'm going to use Apollo in the both in the front end and back end personally, and because, like, their full stack just kind of, it takes into account a lot of the edge cases that exist. So I think it would definitely be a mistake today to kind of, like, roll your own thing from scratch. There's really no reason to do that. There's a lot of good frameworks that take care of this for you. So I think that's probably my main takeaway right now.
That's great advice.
Well, that rounds out our community question and answers. Thanks to all the awesome community members who submitted those questions. Thanks, John, for hearing them. Final thoughts from you, parting words, John, as we before we let you go.
Oh, I don't know. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been nice getting to chat about this, and I guess a message to anyone who's listening is, definitely check out GraphQL. I think it's pretty great. I think it's at the very least worth some time investigating. I think that's about it. But yeah, thank you.
And also, if people want to check out your GraphQL guide that you're currently in the works with, they can actually get the beta right now, right? So if they go to graphql.guide, is that the best place for them to start? Yep.
You can go there. You can pre-order and get access to the full beta book as we're working on it. Yep, they're both online and ebooks as well.
Yeah, I'm excited. I see that it's compatible with Kindle, and because I travel so much, my Kindle is my best friend. That's where I get all my reading done, so that's great.
Excellent.
Very cool. Well, that is our show. Suz, thanks so much for joining me all the way from Hawaii. Hey, go hit the beach and enjoy your vacation.
Will do. It looks like no one is there right now because it's so early, so I'm very excited to get out there. Thanks for having me.
Yes, please enjoy.
And one last word before we let y'all go. We will be at JSConf. So look for the JS Party t-shirts. Look for many of our panelists. I believe, Suz, will you be there?
Yeah, I'll still be in vacation mode. So if you see me wearing lots of tropical looking attire, it's because I've just come back from Hawaii. But I would definitely be there, and I'm very excited.
Awesome. Very good. Suz will be there. K-Ball will be there. I believe Nick and I think Faraz as well. So we plan on having stickers. We plan on having t-shirts. Might be first come, first served on those. And then also there will be a live JS party from the JSConf stage, I think on the first day. So stay tuned for that. If you are going to JSConf, hit us up. We would love to connect with you. And that is our show for this week. So thanks so much for everybody, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Thank you for tuning in to JS Party this week. Tune in live on Thursdays at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern at changelog.com/live. Join the community and Slack with us in real time during the shows. Head to changelog.com/community. And do us a favor, share this show with a friend, rate us on Apple Podcast, go into Overcast and favorite it. And thank you to Fastly, our bandwidth partner. Head to fastly.com to learn more. And we move fast to fix things around here at Changelog because of Rollbar. Check them out at rollbar.com. We're hosted on Linode Cloud servers. Head to linode.com/changelog. Check them out and support this show. Our music is produced by Breakmaster Cylinder, and you can find more shows just like this at changelog.com. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.